Hey everyone, and welcome to this week's On the Spot. I'm Zach Strickland here with, as always, JP Hampstead. JP, welcome, our Director of Passport Research here at FreightWaves. So, you know, I can't say that things are the same as last week, but the more that they change, the more they stay the same. Is that accurate?
Yes, that's accurate and very philosophical of you, Zach. We continue to pull back from sort of peak contracted truckload volumes. Right now, OTVI, or just our outbound tender volume index, is about 10,900, which is, it was, what did it peak at?
It was just under 13,000.
Yeah, so
12,900.
It's pulled back significantly, and it seems like the drop in volumes is starting to accelerate a little bit.
Yeah,
would you say that?
Yeah, we're starting to see some acceleration in our volume drop. We're starting to see some noted acceleration in the tender rejection drop as well. We're back down to around 14% on our outbound tender rejection index, which is roughly where it was on March 18th.
I see. On the way up.
Yep, on the way up.
So it's okay. And yeah, you mentioned earlier before we started filming that the outbound tender rejections are kind of lagging the volumes by like a week or so. Is that right?
Yeah. It looks like OTRI is running about 7 to 8 days behind tender volumes. So that means that, it makes sense if you're thinking about this intuitively. It takes a little while for that capacity to tighten as all these volumes are increasing. Carriers are increasingly on the move, increasingly out of position. Volumes are going a little rampant. Takes a little minute before they realize, hey, we don't have the capacity to service all these pickups. And then on the backside, of course, it takes a minute for everybody to get back into place and start realizing, oh, I can manage this. And so little bit by little, we're getting back to where we were before.
And typically, the way we think about it is that volumes lead tender rejections, which lead movements in spot rates.
Yeah, in demand side contractions like we see right now, or demand side tightening like we see right now, which is not like your Christmas and Thanksgiving and July the 4th situations.
Side, right.
There's a little bit of a demand side, but there's also a lot of supply side as people are taking vacations, they're coming off the road, etc. So that's kind of the invisible part. So tender rejections actually were up higher, they typically are up higher in those times a year because the supply side's down.
Right.
Of course, the demand was so strong this time that we broke through our Christmas levels by about March 20th or so.
And we've spoken earlier, I think maybe last week, about some other kinds, part of the nature of this unusual peak in volumes might keep tender rejections higher. Specifically, the fact that some shippers are seeing unusually high volumes, some shippers are seeing unusually low volumes, makes it more difficult for large asset-based carriers to allocate capacity efficiently and correctly, which in turn leads to higher tender rejections, things like that.
Correct. I mean, you're seeing the nature of, carrier networks are based on knowing they're going to have 15 loads a day coming from Dallas going to Chicago, and then another 15 loads a day coming from Chicago to Atlanta, and so on and so forth across the country. So the hard part about what we're seeing right now is probably due to the fact that a lot of these imbalances in their network are really becoming more apparent.
Right.
But also the fact that if there's drivers sitting around more often now, they're not being able to get into position. And we're seeing
and where the volume is could be in lanes or facilities that are seeing higher wait times and sort of hurting driver productivity, even with the hours of service regulations being lifted for certain kinds of freight.
Right. It doesn't matter if your hours of service are lifted if you can't get to where you're supposed to be in a timely manner. Now, you were talking about, before the show, we were talking about how you noticed a few of the markets in the country that were notably higher than the others. So we're sort of seeing this manifest itself in our data.
So some of the larger markets have fallen off even faster than national average volume. So if you look at markets like Los Angeles or Chicago or Elizabeth, New Jersey, the volumes have really deteriorated sharply to where they're well below kind of where they should be on a year-over-year basis. But to the larger markets that we noticed that are actually performing pretty well, still coming off their peak, but with volumes well elevated above a normal level, are Atlanta and Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Can you talk about some of the reasons why those markets might be performing so well right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're, theoretically speaking, these are markets that are outside, well, not necessarily Atlanta, but these encompass areas that are outside of large, densely populated metro areas. I think you came up with this idea that, as these denser populated areas are doing more shelter at home, they're shutting down more businesses, et cetera, that's going to be less freight, obviously, from that aspect. But I think also what you're seeing is the fact that a lot of these kind of sparse outlying metro areas, as Harrisburg and Atlanta have in them,
right, are
breeding grounds for DCs and warehouses. And these consumer products and food warehouses are abundant in Atlanta, et cetera. I mean, so what you're probably seeing is that's being held up by that continued demand of those specific types of goods. So the shippers that are in these areas, in these markets, are going to be a little bit more active, converse to the Elizabeth, New Jersey, where you really have a lot of manufacturers or warehouses that are dependent on ports, that type of volume, Los Angeles.
But Elizabeth is not like the same kind of destination for imported food as, for example, Philadelphia is.
Correct.
That's interesting. Yeah. Now I want to say that, I haven't sort of tried to quantify this, but I have a hunch that because local and state governments in the Southeast were a little bit slower to impose work and movement restrictions, that there might just be there might be more kind of receivers open, more businesses open, a little bit more economic activity in that region, which could be driving volumes out of Atlanta. I really don't know, but that may have something to do with it.
I think there's credence to that, especially in the South. Again, population density is not as much as it is in the Northeast, nor is it in LA. LA, Elizabeth, New Jersey, Chicago, all some of the most densely populated areas in the country. Houston is a huge city, but it's very spread out. Atlanta is a huge city, but again, it's very spread out. It's got a lot of real estate to work with. That also, kind of lends itself to the fact that these warehouses are built on cheaper real estate. So that's going to have a bigger impact. That's a DC freight environment versus a manufacturing or port holding facility.
Correct. Yeah, you mentioned Charlotte as another strong market that's doing pretty well. Again, off peak, but still really elevated.
Yeah, Charlotte is a consumer market for sure. So again, there's probably a few DCs in that area that are really pumping out the volume to make sure they're supplied. But it's normally a very backhaul market, which means that there's a lot more inbound than outbound. But the markets around it do have a high amount of outbound as well. So Atlanta actually feeds the Charlotte market quite a bit with that freight. That's one of the biggest lanes in the country, Atlanta to Charlotte, because Atlanta acts like a hub. And again, that's probably why we're seeing some of this propping up in the Atlanta market, because these hub areas are supplying the freight to these consumer centers.
We're seeing some pretty interesting stuff on the ocean as well, if we want to kind of look forward to what may be coming to our shores in the future. Still seeing quite a few blanked sailings, both from China and from on the eastbound Trans-Pacific, but also on the westbound transatlantic from Europe. A lot of sailings are being canceled, and that's in the face of an anticipated rebound in Trans-Pacific volumes that should be hitting American shores in the next 4 to 6 weeks. So, with Chinese production coming back online, they're rushing to, fill orders to get their workers back going, get their economy back going. But this is happening when demand in North America is cratering, and warehouses are, have a lot of times have been restocked, are full. Inventory levels are still high for a lot of things, not necessarily food, but the kinds of sort of manufactured goods that, the things that people would be buying in spring and summer,
right,
that they would be loading now, people haven't gone out and bought yet.
Yeah, and to that point, I think you guys had a report that was stating about the retail. We had a lot of retail cancellations coming up over the summer. Is that accurate?
Yes. Yep. And so, but there's going to be this weird, like, sort of, people are talking about port congestion, bottlenecks in the supply chain, especially in the Southern Californian ports, where retailers, not only do they not necessarily have room to receive this freight and process it in their supply chains, but in a lot of cases they could get into a little bit of financial stress if they're laying out cash to take claim of this cargo, and their revenues are going to zero.
Right.
So, not a position they want to be in. So, and again, if you think about Asian imports like apparel, things like that,
yep,
can be really a challenge. People aren't going to the store and trying on clothes. They're not going on vacation. They're not going out to restaurants. They're not going to work. They're not going to large events. They're not buying clothes. And a lot of that is like, there's a spring season, there's a summer season. So things like that are going to be really challenged. And we're just kind of keeping an eye. There were earlier issues with empty containers piling back up at the ports with no way to get home to Asia, and I just think that we've just now started to see sort of the knock-on effects of the initial wave of canceled sailings following the coronavirus outbreak in China, and it's still kind of percolating and rippling through the supply chain. It's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out.
Now, we have seen a little bit of recovery in some of that China volume coming to the United States, but have we seen anything really significant that makes you think that they are actually back to operating 100%?
No. Volumes are going up, like in terms of, like, if you look at like customs imports to the Port of LA and Port of Long Beach, they're going up, but I mean, they're still, double digits off any kind of normal level.
Yeah, and I think that, the interesting thing to watch as this thing is unfolding is, even as we reach, here, I think they're forecasting the peak of outbreak here in the next 2 weeks in terms of case growth, and then, of course, unfortunately, the deaths follow that a few weeks later. But depending on how we, reduce the limitations on people's travel, going to work, etc., there's still a big unknown about how all this, the bottlenecks are going to have this downstream effect for months to come. Do you think that's accurate? Do you think there's going to be?
Oh yeah, I think it's going to be a huge problem because as companies come back online in certain parts of the country and in certain parts of the supply chain, whether it's a manufacturer who wants to ramp production but its suppliers are shut down, or whether it's a transportation company that's getting back to work but its customers aren't. You're going to have all sorts of those things where the pace of production and the movement of freight is going to proceed at kind of the pace of the weakest link in the supply chain in a way. So I think companies are going to have to get creative. They're going to have to communicate with all of their partners upstream and downstream, and really think, sort of thoughtfully about what a return to full operations really looks like for them.
What do you think some of the sectors are that are going to show up first, like when they all start returning to work? I mean, obviously the restaurants will be able to function somewhat regularly again, but then they may not have customers. So,
right.
Outside of that, what do you think some of these sectors, maybe in the manufacturing that might?
I mean, honestly, I think one of the biggest indicators, how we know we're going to reach a tipping point is when it's not a commercial segment, but when schools reopen, if they do reopen, right?
Right. Yeah, we're about to be summer here in America.
Right. Yeah, so that's going to be. I think that's going to be interesting. I mean, as far as other sectors go, I think you might still see places like movie theaters and restaurants and gyms have very sort of like a limited availability, or maybe they only will open up for like 25% capacity, 50% capacity. We've seen that in China. But I'm talking more just about. Will a factory be able to fully staff?
Yeah, when does the automotive sector finally come back online?
Yeah, that might be a good. That might be a good indicator of like when it's perceived to be safe for like heavy industry to be back?
Well, one thing's for sure is that we still have a long way to go, unfortunately, before we see probably any of this materialize. We still got a few weeks to go in terms of what everybody's anticipating for the peak of the outbreak here in America, but that remains to be seen. So, well, that'll wrap it up for this week. JP, thank you as always.
Thanks.
And everybody, stay safe out there and wash your hands.